Joey Clark,
Hello.
it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Jeffrey.
Now, do you have a new webpage that we should immediately announce? You've got an official site on Facebook, right, Joey Clark?
Yes, I believe it's facebook.com/the Joey Clark is the URL link, but you can search it. I look about how I do now, black and white photo. It's just Joey Clark.
So, and it's important that people go out there and like that because we're working on getting you a fan base for your official page, which I know you were reluctant to do, of course, but you know.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Friend, you know.
So please, folks, like my page.
Yeah, there you go. So we're going to talk about politics, if it's okay.
Sure.
Tomorrow is a big day, and I've been looking forward to it. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's in any case, it's very much present in my mind. What I'm most curious about is the relationship between the actual vote in Iowa and what the polls have been saying. And this has been a poll-obsessed campaign like no other, right? I mean, we have technology, information distribution systems. You know, the leading candidate in the Republican Party does nothing but talk about his poll results. So what is your sense of what the relationship between the polls and the reality?
I think Iowa could upset the polls. I think the polls reflect New Hampshire and the other states better. But Iowa, because of their caucus system, it could be anybody's game. And Iowans are known to be quite fickle, and they'll change their minds at the last second. Now, the Republican caucuses are not as involved as the Democratic caucuses. So I think it works where you show up at your precinct and you cast a secret ballot, and then the number of votes is given proportional. The number of delegates is given proportional to the percentage that people get. And the Democrats are a little more involved. And I tend to think because you actually have to go out and caucus, this bodes well for Bernie Sanders, and it bodes well for anybody else who has a great ground game. The big worry about or concern about Trump, if you're for Trump, is that all this support he's getting in the polls won't be showing up in Iowa. But Trump, the person running Trump's campaign, I believe, was Rick Santorum's guy last time, and Santorum ended up winning Iowa. So Trump very well could end up having his polls reflected in the caucuses. I really don't know. I was watching the news all day today. There's a lot of speculation, and there's a bunch of folks saying, I think this, I think that, but we don't know. This is why we actually vote.
Well, is anybody saying that Trump's support is exaggerated by the existing popular polls?
Yes, there are a lot of folks, and actually Rand Paul is making the case that most of his support will come from young people who aren't reflected in a lot of these phone-in polls, that a lot of the people reflected in the polls are much older. I mean, I don't get calls from pollsters. If I do, I give them a hard time. But so Rand also pointed out that they said, who did you vote for last time in the Iowa primary? And only 9% in this poll said Ron Paul, when Ron got about 20%. So there's a big block of support out there who is not showing up in these polls. And I think definitely Trump, because so much of what his phenomenon is based on is his control of the national media. It could be that folks are sitting at home cheering on Trump while they watch their TVs. They'll answer the phone from a pollster and say, yeah, I love Trump. Trump's my man. But they may very well not go out to the caucuses. I think they're going to show up. Trump is very organized at every single rally he does where he's getting 10,000, if not more people. They sign people up. If they're currently Democrats, they get them to register as Republicans. Everybody who walks into one of his events is given the details and set up to be able to go to the polls on election day. So I think Trump will probably win Iowa. I wouldn't be surprised if he loses and that you see maybe Ted Cruz upset him and then Rubio, depending, it doesn't matter who's in front, Rubio coming in third. I think Trump will probably win Iowa, though I do have a hope that Rand Paul is right about sneaking up on some of these folks, but that remains to be seen.
You said nothing about Jeb, and yet many people were impressed in the last campaign that he showed unusual sort of presence, charm.
Oh, on the debate stage?
Yeah.
See, I found that he bloomed a little more because Trump wasn't there to make him wither, but he gave the usual. I didn't understand the praise for Jeb. I really didn't. I thought Marco Rubio had a good debate. As much as I personally distrust Rubio and despise him, I thought he does very well in that setting. I thought Chris Christie did fairly well. Ted Cruz got a few scars on him, but I think spoke very well to Iowans. So I don't understand sometimes these professional pundits on the national media, their praise for Jeb Bush. I think Jeb could come back. He could have a comeback maybe in New Hampshire or South Carolina. But when you look at the establishment lane, folks like Christie, Rubio, and Jeb, Rubio seems to be the guy actually getting most of the support from the big donors and the other types.
But you remember those? There were two moments in the last debate that impressed me about Jeb, and it was those YouTube comments that somebody would call him to be like a Mexican American. That'd say, "Look, my family's been here since for the last 30 years. I'm feeling a little bit squeamish about the Republican Party's stand on immigration," and then there was the wonderful young web programmer who's an Islamic. She was a Muslim woman, and she too worried about. And Bush just it's interesting. You can sort of discern what drives them, and Bush Jeb just jumped right in. He said, "That's what I'm talking about. We need to have a system that's aspirational for these people. It's not about discrimination based on race and religion." He was passionate and dedicated to that topic. And I would say of all the candidates, he was the only one that seemed to actually welcome the question and address it well.
Well, as opposed to Ben Carson, especially on the young Muslim woman. Ben Carson, I believe, is the one they went to first, and he was almost shocked, surprised. "Oh, I get that question? Oh, no." Yeah. And he made some statement about national security and immigration. I thought Jeb Bush gave the correct answer there, though he didn't. He did well in the sense that he gave the correct answer. You should be aspirational. We should be welcoming in immigrants. Should be a nation for all people without demonizing a whole class of folks. But he still, based on her question, I unfortunately can't remember the young lady's name, but based on her question, she really opened up the field for them to say something even more aspirational than just a technical answer on immigration. And Jeb hinted at that, but he could have gone bigger and broader. And I think this is part of his problem. He's such a wonk. He is quite an intelligent man. I think most people you talk to in Florida, Democrat or Republican, liked his tenure as a governor in Florida, but he tends not to be able to inspire the sort of movement that you need in a presidential campaign.
Which is a little bit alarming in some ways, but still, I thought it was a good answer. It wasn't the answer that Republicans wanted to hear, though.
Right, it wasn't.
And I'm at the point of thinking that it's not to your credit if you win this nomination. I mean,
right, and well, I find myself once again at peace because I'm not supporting anybody in particular. I'd kind of like to see Rand Paul upset some folks, but not being in support of anyone. I don't have the same anxiety and stress of is my guy gonna do well, and also the sort of dishonesty that comes up when you're supporting somebody. You give them more of the benefit of the doubt. So I tend to agree with you that whoever wins this nomination probably is going to be very badly beaten up and bruised, and it makes you wonder what sort of movement are they leading exactly. And this is what we talked about last time, but we'll see. Of course, Trump could be playing the sort of strongman fascist card and then come in and do all sorts of stuff. Again, we just don't know.
Yeah. I had this alarming thing happen to me this last week because I've been so shaken up by Trump and the sort of contentless campaign that he's been running. He blows dog whistles and then says he's going to solve them. I mean, he's just such an archetype of an interwar, fascist. And I've been so sort of interested in the sociology of how this is working. I hadn't quite considered what the alternatives to Trump are. And yet I read the National Review forum, and many people were saying this is why Cruz would be so much better. And it was probably for the first time I actually considered, wait a minute, if it's not Trump, it's going to be somebody else. And in which case, I mean, that's not exactly inspiring. So
no, it's not. And I mean, if I had to pick anybody in the field, it would be a Rand Paul type. Then sometimes I want to, it's almost like me throwing a dead cat into a church. I want to say to my fellow conservative friends on talk radio, maybe we should have Hillary Clinton as president in a Republican Congress. Right. Maybe we'll actually get things done. Or from a libertarian perspective, maybe they'll continue to get nothing done. And that's just fine by me.
Well, and this is the only way I actually am able to reconcile this with my own sort of sense of that action and confidence that things are getting better. The state is actually becoming less and less relevant in our lives.
Yes.
That this kind of political insanity we see going on right now is actually representative of the crack up of the system itself. And so I should be cheering it on in some way, but still it worries me just because of my knowledge of history.
Well, and I read something over this weekend where the nation is incredibly divided. They're both pissed off at the establishment, but it's for very different reasons. On the Democratic side of the aisle, people are so tired of these intransigent, so-called principled people that don't want to do anything and won't compromise. And the other side is so tired of these mealy-mouthed compromisers, and we want principled people. And it really is a 50-50 split. And it's along party lines. This is the tendency of problems with Democrats and Republicans, the way they talk past each other. Republicans tend to think Democrats are more principled than they are. And I actually see Democrats, especially like Hillary Clinton, as very pragmatic. And then Democrats tend to see Republicans as much more nefarious and have ulterior motives than the principles they state. And thus, they can't speak to each other a lot of the time.
But and yet, I mean, I know that division is there, but when you look at like what Sanders and Trump represent, they really do represent two flavors of the same kind of authoritarian status paradigm. And it takes us back again to the interwar period. It's like you can choose socialism or fascism. And in practice, they don't actually look all that different.
It really doesn't look all that different in practice. And it makes me think of, I was perusing once again, Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty. And it's both those sides, Trump and Sanders. And really all these folks, like we talk about these alternatives, don't seem that different. It is feeding in that sense of positive liberty or agency over one's life and what you're going to do. Unfortunately, especially when you see Trump and Sanders, who are leading these mass movements, why is it that people hitch their sense of their positive liberty and what they're going to be able to accomplish in their lives to the state, in particular the federal government? Maybe it is, this opens up to a bigger conversation of why people see their salvation, maybe not their spiritual salvation, but their political salvation only through the state. And
part of it really comes out, I was listening to Sanders, but actually, let me back up. We haven't talked about the Democrats. You're pretty certain that Hillary is the candidate and that Sanders doesn't represent a substantial threat?
I think he does, actually. I think Sanders in Iowa, well, certainly in New Hampshire, he's, I believe, beating her in New Hampshire. But if Sanders can upset her in Iowa, and again, this is for Rand Paul what is for Sanders, they have a lot of young supporters, and the Iowa primary is actually being held when college is in session this time. And all sorts of campuses across Iowa, so you will get probably a much larger youth vote. And with these scandals hanging over Hillary Clinton's head.
Well, and they're getting more intense by the day, actually. I mean, now you've got the State Department actually weighing in on the question, which apparently disturbs her narrative. And the New York Times actually concerned about it. I mean, it seems like she's getting bruised and ever more each day with these scandals.
Oh, it is terrible for her. In the last town hall she did before these caucuses, she essentially played, there's nothing to see here. This is what happens to me all the time. People throw all this stuff at me. They see what sticks to the wall and nothing ever sticks. And let me just tell you, I've been through this, and you young people supporting Bernie Sanders, this is your first time. So she should have just said, bless your hearts, this is how politics works.
Yeah.
But the fact that that was her approach to the scandals, then you get the Obama administration coming out through Josh Earnest, one of the least earnest people I've ever seen, by the way. He comes out and says the Obama administration cannot say that she won't be indicted, which put positively is Hillary Clinton may be indicted. They didn't want to put it positively. So this looks incredibly bad for her. A lot of these emails that have been recently found by the FBI are so sensitive they can't be released to the public. They can't even be redacted. Like they're only supposed to be in certain people's hands. And the fact that she had them on this private server, some would say it's not analogous to the Petraeus situation where he gave some sensitive material to his biographer and mistress, who I guess he was doing push-ups with her. They were both quite health nuts. They said, well, see, Petraeus gave that to somebody else. Hillary didn't give the classified info. She just had it on her server. That's wrong. She gave the whole server to a tech company. She allowed people that have no clearances whatsoever access to that server.
Yes.
So she's in very much hot water. For the longest time, I didn't think she would be indicted, that there would be some trick where she would get out of this. But with what transpired on Friday and over the weekend, she's in a lot of trouble, and that means good things for Bernie Sanders. But here's the wrinkle, and we've been talking about this on our local shows on the radio for months, is Joe Biden, when he said, I'm not going to run, the speech he gave was in the Rose Garden, at the podium with the presidential seal. The president standing right to the background of him. And if you take out the beginning of the speech where he's saying, I'm not running, the whole speech sounds like he's running. And so the way the Democrats' primary system works with these superdelegates, watch for somebody like Joe Biden to try to hop in, or as they heard these rumors of Michael Bloomberg would get into the race as an independent third party in the general election if the nominees for the Democrats and Republicans are respectively Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So there's a lot of wrinkles to this. Even if Bernie Sanders starts topping out Hillary Clinton, he's not necessarily going to be the nominee. And partly this is the best of both worlds for these sort of elitist Democrats, that if Hillary can stay in the race a little longer and sort of keep Bernie tamped down to where he doesn't get complete control of the process, then Hillary, the shoe drops, the piano falls on her head, she's done. Then they can put Joe Biden in. If it happened too early, then and Bernie gets all the support with Hillary out of it, then there's not much of a way Biden could get in. So we'll see what comes down. I'm starting to lean towards Hillary's, and he's deep. She's in deep.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing that I assume that the motivating factor here for her was essentially technological ignorance. She didn't really understand. She was using her cell phone the way everybody uses their own cell phones, right? Am I right about that?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a nefarious desire to share information and release secrets and that sort of thing, which I don't even care. I mean, like I want all secrets to be released instantly. I like everything to be posted on Reddit, so I don't actually care about that stuff. But I assume that it wasn't malice, or it wasn't intentional. It was just sort of technological ignorance and a sense that all life is in my cell phone. I'm on the road and clicking around here and there. Right?
I believe so. She said it was for convenience. Now, this doesn't matter in the eyes of the law. The non-disclosure agreement she signed, just like General Petraeus signed, one part of the law, you don't have to have malice or intent, just negligence.
Yeah.
So she'll still be in trouble. But I don't think it's malice, but there's a part of Hillary Clinton that she's an admirer of Henry Kissinger. I think she fancies herself sort of a working gal's Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger, oddly enough, also behaved this way with his records when he was serving public offices. And right now, much of Kissinger's records are still sealed and won't be open until 5 years after his death. And I think Hillary likes being able to control her image, her legacy. she likes being, so I think it was more than just convenience. Not, again, not nefarious, like she's treasonous or anything like that, but she likes controlling the process, especially her own. This is the weird mix of a lot of these folks who run for president. At one point, they seem incredibly confident in these masters of the world that can solve all of our problems. Then you meet them in a back room, and they're some of the most insecure people in the world.
Exactly. No, well, tell me, why is Bernie Sanders so? You act as if the establishment would find him intolerable. I mean, why is that true? I mean, why can't he just be the nominee and that's it?
Oh, they'll think he'll lose, I think, is what it comes down to. I mean, what Marco Rubio said in the last debate was that Bernie Sanders is a socialist, but he's a great candidate for president of Sweden. And that would, I think, play very well in a general election. They're not going to listen to Bernie's detailed points, and he actually doesn't have that many details yet. They will just brand him a socialist, as European, un-American. We've already had enough big government. This is one of the questions Chris Cuomo put quite well to him, is that Bill Clinton said the era of big government is over. And now you want to bring it back? Of course, I'd be like, come on, Chris Cuomo.
Really talk like that. I mean, you'd think by listening to him that he, in fact, is a liberator from the control of Wall Street and that sort of thing. And, Joey, there's another factor, too. And I was watching this very carefully over the weekend, just like what he's saying. And I was reminded of FDR in 1931 and 32. FDR was the one candidate who spoke out for the repeal of prohibition. And this was very important to his election, the fact that he wanted you to have the right to go have a beer. And Bernie Sanders is talking a lot these days. You can look at his Twitter account and see it, about what an outrage it is that so many people that pot is criminalized, and that so many people are arrested and jailed and harassed so continually for pot distribution and consumption. And I've wondered if that is part of the reason why he's just wildly favored on college campuses, in addition to his claim that he's going to give everybody free tuition.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. I must say, I mean, I do impersonations of Bernie Sanders on air. I think his economic program is nonsense, bunch of hokum. But I genuinely like Bernie Sanders because he's honest. He doesn't seem pretentious, and he seems to actually believe in his ideals, which is refreshing. Hillary Clinton said in that last town hall that we campaign in poetry and we govern in prose, which was quite revealing. And it reminds me of a Huxley quote of that ideals are the garments political gentlemen drape over their will to power. So I think a lot of these folks who are running the Democratic Party, just running the government in general, they're fine with spouting ideals to the public, as long as we understand that sort of a face we put on. Bernie seems genuine. He actually believes in democratic socialism as he understands it. And this is what I find endearing about the man, and I think what scares the establishment, that he doesn't want to play ball with the usual politics. And if you look at his record in the Senate, he doesn't play ball. He doesn't have that many pieces of legislation passed. He doesn't co-sponsor much in the Senate, or at his time in the House, he didn't pass much. The only thing he passed was reform of the Veterans Administration. So,
and there are aspects to his program that can appeal to a kind of a libertarian mind. I mean, he's been better on the pot question than anybody, including Rand Paul, who's slightly, even though I think in his heart he's in favor of radical decriminalization and even legalization, he always hedges it slightly with this sort of states' rights thing. Whereas Bernie is pretty tough on the issue. I mean, he's very open and aggressive on the point. And on war and peace, he seems like he's trying to signal that he's the least likely to take us to war. So there's aspects of this democratic socialism that are actually more libertarian than all the other candidates.
Absolutely. And it is a weird thing on the democratic socialist side, which, to be honest, I think most of the Democrats are democratic socialists. They just won't use the name because it doesn't have currency in the United States yet. But there's something to the democratic socialists that allows a space of personal freedom. They understand sort of personal autonomy in many ways. until you start talking about economics and
Yeah.
economic rights. And for some reason, that is something to be controlled. I don't understand why they think this. I mean, I could maybe be more charitable and try to understand, but they do quite well on criminal justice reform,
Yes.
on decriminalizing many, many things. Bernie Sanders is refreshing on those issues.
That's right. I mean, he is most allied with Rand Paul on questions of personal liberty, actually, and probably speaks more forthrightly in a way in which Rand has never caught on college campuses. Bernie is easily the most popular candidate.
Well, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Bernie is using the term revolution, and Rand's dad, Ron Paul, used the term revolution, that we are going to speak. Well, Ron truly was an abolitionist. Bernie speaks like an abolitionist, but he's not really trying to abolish much. Maybe the 1%. The big banks are running this country, Jeffrey. Look, I respect Hillary Clinton. I love Hillary Clinton. I won't say anything about her husband, Bill. What he did was deplorable, but I'm not going to say anything about him. He's quite endearing, and that, I mean, who doesn't love that accent?
Yeah.
And I've just find that this brings us to the sort of what we build this show tonight about is this marginalization.
Yeah.
That you have, again, if Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders ran together, and you could have Rand Paul's economic ideas, that's the ideal candidate right there.
Yeah. But that doesn't exist. I mean, there's no thing called libertarianism that has any presence in public life, as far as I can tell, anymore. There's pieces of it, widely distributed in inauspicious and unpredictable ways, but there's not anything like the ideology that you and I think of as being libertarianism, a consistent defense of civil, economic liberty together with a peace.
Well, and I thought about this long and hard, knowing this was going to be the subject. And based on what we were just talking about, how Bernie Sanders is not popular with the establishment of the Democratic Party, and how Ron Paul is never popular, and even Rand is not popular with the establishment because they're too idealistic. And this is constantly what I get from my conservative friends and from my left-wing friends, is that, oh, you just want utopia. You want all these things, but then, and you see constantly these posts of why libertarians are so marginalized. Why are libertarians? Why do they all look like you and I, Jeffrey? Why are they all white men? Sometimes you get the label rich white men, and I'm like, well, I'm not rich. Watch out. And so I see all these pieces, and I say, well, let's not single out libertarians as being marginalized. Is the anti-war movement that helped propel Barack Obama to the presidential chair,
Right.
were they empowered when he became president? No, they were used. Is the pro-life movement so often appealed to in presidential campaigns?
Right, yeah.
There are a lot of these groups who are marginalized, and the only people that seem to be empowered are the folks who are actually playing the game of using state power for your particular interest in, incremental ways.
Yeah, it seems true, and absent a kind of a flourishing libertarian ideology, which may never actually flourish in its ideological purity that you and I came to accept. These sort of sporadic endorsements of liberty tend to manipulate the voters, and I think it's been true in our entire time. I mean, George Bush Sr. was elected based on his promise of or was it Junior, of a more humble foreign policy, for example, and then immediately started a global war. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I find that, well, of course, politicians say one thing on the campaign trail and do another. As Hillary said, campaign in poetry, govern in prose. And it's funny that her prose might be what brings her down, considering all that prose in those emails.
Yeah, right.
But I also tend to think that the libertarian philosophy is, the more I study it, is not it's coherent in its basis, its basic foundations. But especially when I revisited Berlin essay, The Two Concepts of Liberty, there seems to be a sort of tension still within classical liberal thought. And just, if we could put it simply, the argument over what the basic idea of liberty means, what it purports for our lives. And in particular, this idea of positive liberty, that what are you able to do? What are you able to achieve in life? And when I listen to most of the folks on the campaign trail, unfortunately, people have hitched their positive liberty, which I think is a good thing. You talk about this all the time, of being entrepreneurial, of being dynamic and selling these ideas. Most people have somehow hitched their positive sense of self-fulfillment and flourishing to the state. And many times I think, well, we can think about our bleeding heart friends.
Yes.
I was reading Steve Horowitz talking, and I love his writing. But sometimes they make distinctions without much of a difference to me, saying that, well, there are some libertarians that are too pure on the idea of wanting to have liberty pure and simple. So like the marriage question, that the state shouldn't be involved in marriage whatsoever. And, well, no, we should be. And then Steve Horowitz comes back and says, well, no, we should be excited about the Supreme Court's ruling, because one principle of classical liberalism was equality before the law. And he gives out gives a thought experiment of, imagine if we had a Social Security system that only went to white males. Would you then say, oh, let's get rid of Social Security? Or would you say, no, let's include everybody in the system because of equality before the law? I don't see the true difference. I see his distinction, but I don't see the true difference in the sense of, yeah, let's have true equality before the law. Get rid of that racist Social Security system.
But this is the problem. It's not usually an option. The option that's presented to us is a little different. I mean,
right.
A good example of this might be, for example, women's suffrage. So as classical liberals, we don't really believe in democracy. We think there ought to be just, the kind of decisions people make ought to be those over their own property and their own lives. You shouldn't be allowed to make those decisions over other people's lives. And yet it came really down to it, that sort of great liberal movement of women's suffrage. Libertarians, even at the time, had disagreements, And I think about Albert J. Nock in particular, who ultimately came down on the side of women's suffrage just based on the fact that it was not that continuing to deny the vote, for a regime to deny the vote that was permitted to men. It was a symbolic sort of institutionalization of misogyny, really, essentially, and that part of the liberal project is about inclusiveness. On the other hand, if we had a draft today, and men were being drafted, would you really want to, based on that principle of inclusion, to expand that draft to women? I don't think so. So it's,
and I would of course say, if we're going to have a vote, everybody should be able to vote. But one unfortunate thing, and you certainly see it around here in, where I'm from, you're from around these parts, in Montgomery, Alabama, where the civil rights movement of the 60s really gets going. And there were so many amazing things accomplished there. And I love much of what Dr. King had to say. In particular, I think a lot of libertarians can learn from is fostering more of a positive peace as a community rather than the sort of negative peace I think the movement sort of has. But there's this residual effect of when people get included, when they're empowered to be part of the governing process, the democratic process, as we put it, they start to think that's what freedom means. Freedom isn't my individual autonomy to say to these racists who are holding their, who are tyrannizing me. It's not to just tell them to stop. I see many of these things that are women's liberation and liberation of minorities in the country also happen through the courts, the very undemocratic institution in the society. And so there's this residual effect of, no, the true freedom you have in this nation is to vote every 2 or 4 years.
right.
And that, I think, is very dangerous, though it's not, I see where that comes from. That goes all the way back to Greece. So
Well,
I get that.
and that's the thing I wanted to say about you're actually reminding me of something very important. I don't know if you've encountered Benjamin Constant's brilliant essay called the difference between ancient and modern liberty. So he's this 18th century, I guess, French classical liberal, and he said exactly what you just said, that liberty in the ancient world was about the inclusion in the process of governing. So if you were free, that really meant that you had some say over the shape of regime that governed you, and that's what freedom meant. It wasn't like commercial freedom or universal rights or free speech, freedom of religion. These were unknown ideas in the ancient world. Freedom meant you could possibly have some influence over the Roman Senate, or that you were consulted in some sense over the shape and direction of the country's civic affairs. That's what freedom was. But with the birth of modernity, we discovered that was an illusory form of freedom, that real freedom really is about property ownership and trade and having your rights recognized so that you can organically achieve a greater social progress, and so that you can move through classes and have aspirations for your life. And that was all about commerce and trade. So it's a very different understanding of what liberty really is. And yet we keep reverting back to this ancient idea.
Yes, and I'm not certain why, though. I mean, I could speculate all night long on it, especially when you look at some of the people who forecasted this, maybe. Like I always, lately, I bring up Tocqueville a lot.
Yes,
and
I've been talking about Tocqueville a lot myself. Yeah.
And he, I think, prophesies the soft despotism, and that I think we are currently living under domestically. It's not necessarily in its intentions cruel, but de Tocqueville was quite right in saying that if you lose democracy in America is wonderful, but if you lose the three aspects that make it so, that it's very local, that it's for the most part voluntary. The voting is almost kind of like a formal stamp on what voluntary associations want to do anyway. And that it is infused with the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty, that there is this hope in people being able to better their lives. If you lose that, what we will have is this central power that instead of raising children to become men and women, it will keep them in perpetual childhood. And it will do it for reasons of compassion and making sure they have equal station. It's exactly what it sounds like to me from the Democratic side these days. And I could maybe say the number one thing that has centralized us is war, unfortunately. And we wonder, why is it throughout history that libertarians always seem to be marginalized? I think I said to you a long time ago at a dinner table, I said, well, Jeffrey, it's because the authoritarians shoot the libertarians. Yeah. And I mean, look at the history of any major people. I've been having fun. Like, there's some videos called Epic History. And when you look at the major history, they don't tell the history of a people based on necessarily its art or its great innovators or these sort of things. Sometimes that's brought up. But mostly you're looking at a global map, and you're looking at where the boundaries were redrawn after wars. And when I look at this nation, it comes back to, especially after the Second World War, America starts becoming defined more by this ethnic experience and this common bond that we need the central power to take care of us. Combine that with a sort of what I think is good. This egalitarianism that says equal rights is just fine in my book. I like to describe myself as a egalitarian who respects distance and difference. But then it gets unhinged when you start thinking, oh, we must constantly be leveling. Social justice means constantly looking for the inequities, even if inequities exist for voluntary interaction. Oh, that's not good enough. We must constantly be searching for this equality that can never really be found, which that sets up for a constant giving up of freedom for power's sake. And this is actually what Isaiah Berlin warns about in that essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, is it constantly, you can think of people reasonably going, okay, I'll give up some of my liberty for security, that we maybe need a organized army to defend against folks. That makes sense to me. But if you constantly are moving for this notion of equality that doesn't seem quite clear, And in order to get it, every time, at every step, you're giving up more of your liberty. Well, it's leading you to a, unfree place.
You know, your comments also remind me of something you said last week to me that was a revelation. I hadn't really thought it through. That so much of the basis of, I mean, if the basis of Sanders' support is college students a little bit confused about the nature of government, socialism, but otherwise wanting to not be harassed for their pot usage and not wanting to pay their tuition bills. The basis of Trump's support is essentially a generational issue. It's the last gasp of the greatest generation.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was a revelation to me. I don't think I'd heard anybody else make that point, but I do think it's a very interesting observation. I've always thought of this greatest generation rhetoric as being basically harmless, that it was going to pass and it would go away, whatever. Tom Brokaw, narrating the stupid, PBS series or whatever. But I never really thought of them as a dangerous voting bloc. But now you seem to be seeing this all come to fruition, and it could give us a dictator.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I find myself torn because we've interviewed a lot of people from the greatest generation. We had the candy bomber himself, Gail Halvorson, in our studio. And when I heard that man's story, he's an amazing man that in the midst of war and the aerial blockade put on by the Soviets for Berlin, this man could have just done his job, break the blockade, put supplies into people. That would have been good enough. But he did more, where he started, if for people who don't know the story, he saw these kids on the other side of a barbed wire fence. All he had was a stick of gum in his pocket. He walked away initially thinking, now they'll fight over it. I don't have enough for all of them. But then he says, a voice in his head, God, if you will, turn around, give them that. And he remembers this little blonde girl with these brightest blue eyes, gives the stick of gum to her. She unwraps it, breaks it in half for her brother. And then they break up the wrapper into even pieces for all the children there, just so they could smell the bubble gum. It inspires Halvorson. So he goes home, rips up his bed sheets against orders, rips up his bed sheets, creates these little parachutes, and starts stuffing his candy rations, chocolate bars and whatnot. And after he'd do his runs for supplies for the city, he would drop these little candy bombs on the children. And I'm hearing this story, and I get a call in the radio studio. And this guy says, "Hi, Joey, my name's Pete McCoy, but I used to be called Dieter Hessen. And I remember those parachutes falling on me." And so you hear these stories. I mean, that's just one. And they're amazing. And they do inspire hope. For me, it doesn't inspire sort of nationalism. And then you get others, though, where there is more of that sort of great feel-good story mixes with more the nationalistic stories. So anybody who served is a hero. We had another guy in and who went over to the war. He's one of the gunmen in the bottom underneath the plane. You had to really, crunch yourself in there. And he was, I think, 17. He lied about his age to be able to go to the war. And our host asked him, "Well, what were you thinking when the Japanese attacked him when we were going to war against the Germans?" He said, "Well, as I'm going over there, I'm like, let's kill some Krauts." And that's the other side I'm talking about, that I can understand if somebody attacked the United States, like attacked my backyard in Alabama, there'd be part of me of like, let's kill the person who did that. But when that becomes the driving motivation, and again, this is what I think marginalizes libertarian thought, even when the government doing it is libertarian or classically liberal in name, is war. It sort of makes you, or look at George Orwell's Animal Farm. They start off on the farm with these great principles and songs singing together. And then after they fight a few battles together, it stops being about the ideas they first laid out in their sort of constitution or whatever, their manifesto or whatever. And it started being about the blood they shed and the sacrifice they made for this identity as a group. And that's what I think World War II really set up. In some ways, very, very good, like the story of the candy bomber. In some ways, bad in sort of the nationalistic, don't tell me what to do. And if you do impede on me, I'm not just going to make you stop. I'm going to kick your ass, if not kill you. And thus where we are.
You're. Did you watch the Obama State of the Union address?
No. I must admit, the last time I did, I almost threw up in my mouth.
Okay. But it was much better this time, I must say. But,
okay, good.
It was good. Well, I wouldn't say good, but it was better. But he talked about the U.S. defense budget, and it was funny because he said, "Look, we're not going to become weak. There's no chance of that. We spend more than the next 8, biggest spending governments around the world combined. We are. It's absurd to claim that we're weak." And the whole time in all of his comments, it was strange. He felt a little bit uncomfortable, actually, with the sudden realization that we live in a preposterous country, and a nation that really, demands to be, hundreds of times over the most powerful militarized nation in the world. And this is not exactly compatible with a normal sense of nationhood and global community spirit. It's almost like he was interesting that he just made the point that we are an empire, and
yeah.
And that may be good and may be bad, but here's the reality.
Well, and I think Obama is correct in that assessment if all we were trying to do was defend ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I brought this up last time, everybody running for president says we reserve the right to use military force to defend Americans and protect our interests. And especially when you hear somebody like Marco Rubio talk, he is clearly making the case for empire. Maybe it's not like other empires in history. Maybe it's trying to keep a sort of global liberal order. But that is why they want to build up the military. They want to be able to have the Navy, especially with concerns over China. They want to be able to have the naval power to make sure that we still dominate that part of the world. I think it comes down to the basic geopolitics of it. If the Chinese are able to puncture our sort of naval ring we have around them, if they're able to make sure they control that part of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, then they can project a lot more power. And that's not what the Rubio and his ilk want. They want to be able to dominate the rest of the world, sort of keep China in the box. You hear them talk about, oh, I wish we could still expand NATO to Ukraine, keep Russia in the box, and let's also dominate the Middle East. And so we're essentially the British Imperium on steroids with better toys, better technology.
And apparently more psychopathic rulers, which is a big concern. For years, I've been sort of chronicling in my writings and in my thought the decline of the state as a relevant sort of institution of source for progress, as an instrument for progress in the world, and more the way the old consensus of statism is breaking down. And I think that's just generally true. But what I hadn't entirely, how do I put this? The bad thing is that the state's still around, right?
Oh, sure.
And that somebody is going to be in control of it. And in the midst of this sort of crack up of managerial statism that we saw emerge in the New Deal and World War II, and it's been gradually declining, I would argue, since about the early 1970s, but it's really on fast forward since the information age. So we still have this dinosaur institution out there that somebody is going to run. And what I hadn't anticipated entirely in my mind is just the trauma that is associated with watching the political system become this preposterous and this dangerous. I hadn't entirely anticipated the intervening step, that we're having to go through now. And it's very disturbing, that we can't seem to get political figures out there that sort of embody the spirit like at all. And of course not, because the state is, in a sense, if you want to ascribe emotions or intentions to this amorphous thing we call the state, panicked about its future.
Yes, and it makes me think of history once again. What happens after Julius Caesar is killed? You get you get a crack up of that state, but you also get massive war for I can't remember how long. I was just doing a little bit of reading up on Islamic history. You do have quite an impressive empire, the Caliphate, and then there's the division within it. Luckily, we don't have the same sort of conditions where I don't think our societies just aren't. Well, the violence, I'll put it this way, is specialized. It's done by very few as opposed to these mass armies. But I do worry about what's the old saying? Once you have an empire, you might want to try to keep it, because if you lose it, it could end up very badly. But then, of course, pushing it further could end up badly as well. You look at Russia. Rubio makes some statement of Putin wants to be a great power like Russia used to be, and he couldn't do it economically, so he's trying to do it militarily. So the answer, Marco, and I'll look at Barack Obama, is to put economic sanctions on them, harm their economy even more, to put them more in a box. Isn't this what happened to the Germans after the First World War? So if y'all push them too far, you'll be begging, praying for Putin, because you'll get somebody much crazier running Russia. Same with the Chinese. They do this sort of trading game between the more economically minded and technology minded running the presidency. And then they'll go back to more of the army and the military minded. Right now, we have an economically minded president in China, I believe. So we shouldn't be pushing the Chinese too much either. It should be more about actually extending and opening up borders and trade and doing what the classical liberal project is, rather than this constant saber rattling. People seem to think that makes us look stronger and all this sort of stuff like that. It more seems to assuage their own insecurities about this crack up you keep talking about.
Yeah, and and we're almost out of time, but let me just mention one other thing that I kind of encountered over the weekend under conditions I won't go into any great detail, but I wonder if you can confirm this, and I suspect you will be able to. On the part of Trump supporters in particular, what you see is a kind of revival of this sort of demographic determinist pessimism that you saw 100 years ago, that gave rise to things like eugenics and segregation and Jim Crow laws and that sort of thing. You do have a panic on the part of the older white middle class, essentially, and a prevailing sort of emergent conventional wisdom that we only have a little time left, before it's all over. So we've got to do something drastic now. Have you encountered this kind of thinking?
Yes. And I think it's a belief in sort of this doomsday that's soon to come. Well, because of the man who inspired this podcast, Oscar Wilde. He has a great line that says, "The young know everything, the middle-aged suspect everything, and the old believe everything."
That's great.
And
we've never actually explained the meaning of the term being earnest, so you just look it up, actually, if you don't know.
Right. Well, and I like to tell folks that, we are here to talk about how libertarianism is marginalized, but I tell folks, if I'm being most honest, I consider myself a Bunburyist before I'm ever a libertarian. Yeah. But yes, because the old sort of believe everything, that's of course generalizing and a bit satirical, but they do tend to have their own reality of where the country is right now in their own mind. Some of it's true, some of it's not. And damn it, don't try to convince them otherwise. Just play to it. And of course, Donald is playing to it quite well with his truthful hyperbole.
Well, it's very interesting, too, because in my lifetime, I've never seen this become... I used to laugh about the old movies that showed, interwar British aristocrats, going on with their genetic theories of demographic determinism and it's funny, right? Because they were all kind of proto-Nazis, and you read any of the literature of the the 19 teens, and you've got all these the white aristocracy all, prattling on about eugenics and the science they're going to use to preserve the race and everything like that. And it's funny because we haven't really seen that, at least in my lifetime. I've never seen that become a conventional wisdom. Of course, there's always a group out there that's marginalized and sort of going on about that. But now I'm hearing just regular people say things like this, and it's actually worrisome. They're sounding like Oswald Spengler, with this sort of big theories of demographics and waves of history, and under those conditions, they turn to strongmen.
Well, and I wish we could just take the concept of race and just put it aside. Okay, we can keep race as like a basic theory of like, okay, certain people in certain parts of the world, because of them interacting with their environment, have a little bit of a genetic variance than other people in other parts of the world. Let's just keep it there. This sort of smuggling in of culture and ethnicity and whatnot into the racial questions is what is going to tear us apart and has torn people apart.
And I should say too, like 100 years ago, there might have been some justification for thinking that freedom and good government and prosperity belongs to the white race.
The white man's burden, yeah.
Yeah, this is a century ago, but since World War II, we've seen prosperity just blossom all over the world. Mises talks about this in Theory and History. He actually predicts it. He said this is the difference between theory and history. He says racism, you might be able to find some justification for racist. He says I don't believe it. It's mostly cranky, but you can find some superficial justification for it and looking at history. But theoretically, there's no basis for racism whatsoever. And he forecasts a time when, for example, he says that the Asian countries, could be more awesome than Europe and America in terms of economic prosperity. And he's writing in 1956, 54. And he was right, And so we've lived through this to see this sort of flourishing of freedom all over the world. So it seems like a strange time, 2016, to revive century-old shibboleths.
Well, and to close again with the gentleman who inspired the title of this show, wild, and this is where I come down to that a lot of these things are being revived, I think, because of the stories and the narratives people are telling themselves and are being told by others. That at the end of the day, Wilde has a great point in his little dialogue called The Decay of Lying, where he says, many people think art imitates life. In fact, it's the other way around. Life imitates art. An artist will create a great form or a great picture of the future, what life can be, and people will start to imitate it. And if you look at what people turn to, I think there are great artists out there, great entertainers, don't get me wrong. But if you look at popular culture, and me having my finger in the wind with a lot of the Trump supporters, they loathe it. They find the popular culture doesn't speak to them. And I think this plays into the pessimism. They're sort of seeing the world they knew go away. And so the old passions and the old narratives come back, whether it's a sort of righteous fusion of religion with state power or race and ethnicity with state power. But that's what folks go back to. Again, ideals are what political gentlemen drape over their will to power. You strip away the ideals, strip away the beautiful narratives and fictions we tell ourselves, and all you're left with is power. And
well, I think you've touched on a theme that I don't think we've ever addressed in the podcast or even personally in our many discussions. I would love to pick this up again next week. Does that sound like a good idea? The relationship between art and politics.
Absolutely.
Good. Okay. Let's pick it up, Joey. It's a pleasure hanging out with you tonight.
Great seeing you again, Jeff.
All the best, my friend.
You too.